Useless Monster by Mute Crows. Chapter 2. Chapter 1. Head bowed, Izuku hurried past the gates of Orudera, trying to get to one of the part-time jobs he was probably illegally hired for. He was almost 13 now and still homeless. He didn't even have the condemned building as a place to stay anymore, demolished by someone who bought the lot while he was still in elementary school. His worn bag carried the bare essentials at this point, and he quite literally lived out of it. The only excess he carried was a small Ragged All Might plush and the 2 surviving photos of his mother that he took from the apartment all those years ago.
Oi! Taku!
He did his best to mask the slight flinch, turning as he tried to settle his racing heart. Bakugo's approach was as aggressive as ever, sneer practically etched into his face. He was thankfully without his usual tag-alongs, it seemed.
Yeah, Gachan?
Izuku blastered on the same shaky smile as normal, noticing and praying that the slight pinch to Bakugo's expression in response wouldn't lead to unwanted questions.
The hag asked if you even went to school anymore this morning. Wants to know why Aunt Inko never visits or calls anymore since you moved. Some crap about not being a stranger. Oh, shut it, Taku. I don't care what excuse you have, just tell Andy to call my old hag for once.
Bakugo shoved Izuku to the side as he passed, stalking down the road towards his home. Izuku did his best not to grab at and pull away the sore muscles in the fiery boy's arms. He wasn't injured, just pushed a little close to his limits while showing off in the quirk assessments in PE that day. His former friend hated when Izuku used his quirk on him, even when he wasn't intentionally doing it. After years of practice, it has essentially become second-hand to Izuku to pull away small aches and pains from people on the streets that he passed. Anything at all to help others, because that's what heroes did, right? He had also learned through his personal training that he actually healed much faster than average, likely just to buff the damage his quirk did to himself. Izuku found that the small aches helped him stay awake when he was working multiple shifts at his various jobs, some in more shady parts of town, others warm and welcoming. He looked at the front of the school and yelped softly this time. He was going to be late to his one task, not time-based job, if he lingered any longer. When he got to the back doors of the questionable bar, he was already quickly swapping his school uniform top for a somewhat threadbare shirt, stowing the uniform in his bag before walking in the back door and hanging his bag on the hooks on the wall. He wanted to finish his list of tasks as efficiently and early as he could for tonight. He was hoping to continue his nighttime training. His control was getting much better, and he was learning more about his non-quirk abilities. The plan for when he finished his work was to try and explore more back alleys nearby and test the range of which he can use his quirk while he was inhuman. He waved to the bartender, a woman with a stern hand but kind smile, and set to work in earnest. Izuku finished all of his work an hour or so after the sunset and quietly waved the bartender over. She looked over everything he was tasked to clean, organize, or fix as she pulled out his payment and handed the small stack of paper to him before waving him off. A silent thanks was given and he was off, throwing his bag over his shoulder as he slipped out the back door and into the surrounding dark alleys. He made extra sure that no one was nearby, the fear of being seen when changing ever present in the core of his being, before pulling his plastic bag of cash out and stuffing it in his pocket so that he could stash his bag behind some dumpster without worrying about being robbed while away. Some inexplicable part of the non-quirk making it is that his clothes stayed intact as long as he didn't get directly hit. He could only think of describing it as having another layer of clothing forced on him, except the clothing was a completely different body in every sense of the word. He cast a glance around one last time, took a steadying breath, closing his eyes as he did so, and let go. The change was fast, it always was, borderline explosive. It didn't hurt him in the process as much as he would think it could. It was just a change of state. One moment he was roughly 160 centimeters, and the next he was closer to 230 at the taller set of shoulders. Probably close 4 times longer than he was tall. He was smaller when he was younger, which meant that if he grew any more, that this form was going to get bigger too. A sigh hissed past his teeth, skeletal-esque muscle and face, probably the most distinct part of the monster he could become, the off-white contrasting harshly with the dark green-tinted gray of his short and thin fur. His jaw framed underneath by a collection of variously sized but small pedipalps, a word he found when he looked into what the heck to even call the small appendages scattered on the very top of his throat. He opened his eyes, blinking a few times to adjust to the 4.5 extra sets. Bracing himself a bit on his now 6 limbs, he shook a bit to ground himself in his body in an odd way, the warped and flexible anatomy always taking a few moments to truly settle into before he looked up at the roof of the building he planned on climbing. He crouched, coiled slightly, and leapt as high as he could before gripping the dirty brick close enough to the roof that he could set his chin on the edge. He dug the sharp claws of his rather bird-like back feet into the wall and tucked his bulkier lower arms so that his upper ones could dig in easier. It took a bit of scrambling, but he got over the ledge and sat in a hunch. Looking around as he pressed his 2 feathery antennae forward a moment, taking in the sounds that he could pick up for kilometers around himself before letting them drop back along his neck again. Things sounded relatively normal, no physical fighting or anything audibly happening, so he turned to his quirk, reaching out and feeling for any pains he could pull out of the general night crowd. There was a noticeable spike in the pain levels off to his left, and so he set his sights there. A deep breeze softly wheezed through the open gashes on his ribs. They didn't bleed or ache, but the open hair brushing over what was essentially 5 open wounds on either side was a sensation he was acutely aware of. He pulled on some of the aches close by, feeling the way it seeped into his body, before he got up and began to travel towards the concentrated area of pain. Maybe he could really help out some people tonight while he practiced his movements and tested his limits in the shape of a monster. Izuku kept low to the roofs, avoiding the ground and bright areas as much as he could, and thankful that his underbelly was lighter than the rest of him. It blended in better with the lazy clouds hanging overhead. He pulled on small injuries and various aches as he bounded towards his goal, feeling the way his skin would rend into cuts and scrapes and such as he went, the tugging of his movements making them bleed gently. He was running maybe 15 minutes, still not close enough to the cluster of aches he could distantly feel but not touch, when there was a sudden burst of it 2 streets over, a burst accompanied by shouts of fear and general panic that had Izuku stumbling and skidding across the rooftop, unfolding the massive claws that made up his secondary hands to stop himself from going straight over the edge. The sound of the stone splitting underfoot made him wince, but he quickly refocused on the pain that felt like a series of fractures to the ribs and was moving before he could really think about it, clearing the distance between the roof he was on and the street where the probable fight was happening. A burly man was laughing as he tossed someone down the street, a couple of others behind him grinning as they appeared to ready their own quirks in support. The person that was tossed got up jerkily and shouted something as what must have been some of his buddies appeared and stood by him. It looked like it was squaring up to be some kind of small turf war. For the start of it, Izuku simply watched out of sight on the roof as he debated if he should heal them or not. He didn't know if there was any sense of fairness in street fights. When the kids at school beat on him, the most he got in relief was the teachers maybe calling a kid's name as a slight distraction. He huffed a bit and felt the way his short tail flicked in frustration at the small hang-up. It was when a woman with what looked like some sort of sharp liquid quirk got thrown through a window, throwing her quirk blindly as she went, that he couldn't help the intense need building to help anymore. Her quirk had sliced open one of the legs of the guy who originally got thrown, the muscle falling away slightly, and the man howling in pain as he grabbed at the wound. Izuku's breathing picked up slightly as he yanked away the injuries on said leg and the ribs in the man and gasped softly at the pain that settled into his body. Turns out that trying to help some civilians in a street fight was a mistake! The moment that the man had felt the injuries and pain leave, he twisted sharply in Izuku's direction and threw a hand at him, literally. The hand gripped his muzzle and suddenly jerked him off the rooftop as it returned to its owner. The fight stopped suddenly as the group of people watched Izuku's massive and beastly form hit the ground with a wheeze from the awkward landing, mostly in the shadow of the building he had been perched on. Everyone froze, and Izuku distantly saw a flash from one of the windows that was undoubtedly a picture taken, hopefully too far away to focus properly. Then everything tripped back into motion as Izuku let out the only noise he could easily make in this form, a sharp scream, and tried to run from view. The fight didn't resume as the people panicked, and those who had been fighting decided to unite against Izuku. The hands whipped out and grabbed him again, and he twisted around himself to try and fight them off, tears of panic starting to fall. The people descended like a wave, sudden shouts of making money off of turning in some monster like him echoing off the surrounding buildings. Heart pounding, he tried to ignore the way they ripped at the feathers that littered his shoulders in a crest and tucked the quills on his tail so as to not injure anyone. He just had to get away. It was a complete mess, one that got thrown into a blender as a loud shout of "Yeah!" whipped down the street! No. Oh, no. Oh, please, whatever higher power that may be, not now! Please, not now! Izuku felt the way his body stumbled a moment when the sound hit him. He tucked his antenna as flat as he could, and his gaze locked onto the hero that had arrived, stomach dropping in fear. No, not heroes. Heroes! He knew exactly who they were, too, as he ducked sharply out of the way of a long gray cloth, shot out to grab one of the people on him. Body contorting around itself, he used the sudden surprise of the two to burst out of the pile of people and run! His lithe body coiled slightly with every bound, propelling him faster than the people he had been dragged under as he ran. He pointedly ignored the obvious sound of the street fighters trying to fight the heroes off and shouts of surprise when Quirks didn't respond. He was hoping to get far enough and high before the two heroes finished rounding up the small collection of people. Passing a slightly darker than elsewhere alley, Izuku twisted and darted into it only to find it was a dead end. This was why he needed to learn more back alleys and winding paths to take. His antenna twitched at the sound of two people approaching, and fast. Izuku's heart skipped slightly as he tried to calm his ragged and panic-stricken breathing and blink away the tears streaming from his many eyes because crying did nothing to help him hide. Not knowing what else to do, he just backed into the corner and crouched, curling over himself as much as he could to make himself as small as possible. He felt them before they reached his hiding spot, their injuries. One had a small gash on his arm and burning eyes, who he assumed was Eraserhead because of the vision-based clerk. The other, Present Mike, had a pinched nerve in his shoulder area that was sending off short but sharp twinges of pain. He looked up at them, watching as they skidded into view from their chase. Mike yelped in shock when he saw Izuku. "Yo, what the heck?" Mike whispered to his partner. Eraserhead just fixed Izuku with a sharp look, stance defensive. Izuku wheezed out hiccuping breaths as he did his best to force his warped and misshapen vocal cords to work through his tears. He had curled further in on himself. He didn't want to be taken. He just wanted to help people, and that was all. The movement had Eraserhead flare up with his quirk, but it was dropped the moment it did nothing to change Izuku's form. Guess that proves this definitely isn't a second quirk, Izuku thought bitterly. The hero duo watched Izuku carefully, Mike jumping ever so slightly when Izuku finally got words out. "Please, I just want to go home. I can help you, but please let me go." It was warbled and shaky, broken, lower than his normal voice just because of his sheer size, but it was intelligible. A definite improvement from the slurred warbling that sounded like nothing when he had first tried talking like this ages ago. He felt the steam rising from his wounds and sides in the cold air and saw the confusion flash across their faces. "Not possible." Whatever Eraserhead had planned on saying was dropped as Izuku carefully pulled the injuries out of them and tugged away the pain in his eyes. Izuku blinked rapidly as the tears in his eyes welled up more at the sudden dryness and sprung past the two while they were thrown by their sudden loss of any kind of pain. The lunge made Mike jump to the side with a shout, and he heard the cloth of Eraserhead's weapon whip after him. It almost missed, only gripping onto one of the quills on his tail, and he braced himself. Izuku couldn't help the scream of pain that ripped from him along with the quill, which took a chunk of flesh and skin with it. Hot blood splattered against the ground behind him as he ran, ignoring the collection of people who had their phones out and shouted in confusion after him. He ran, pushing himself to move as fast as he possibly could for as long as he could. The buildings blurred, and he leapt onto a low building just to use it as a stepping stone to a taller one. Fear and pain laced through his being as the stretch and pull of running yanked open the wounds he had even further, and he desperately hoped that the two heroes ended up staying with the people they had captured long enough for him to effectively get away.
Aizawa grumbled as he landed next to Hisashi again,
His longtime friend having stayed to watch the 9 people they had tied down before chasing after
whatever it was that they just ran into. No luck!
A bright grin was thrown his way and Aizawa shook his head. He had tried to follow after the thing, but after a couple blocks it became very clear that the creature was far faster than Aizawa was and knew he had no hope of chasing it down. He would just make a point to track it down after the cops arrived to round up the petty criminals. Street fighting wasn't explicitly illegal if everyone was fully consenting, but the use of quirks in one without a license was. He looked over when Hisashi sighed.
What was that thing, Shana?
How do I know? He glared at him, eyes already starting to ache again, but the cut noticeably stayed gone, healed.
Did it fix you up too?
He just grunted in response.
I have had a pinched nerve all week and it's just gone!
He reached behind his back and scratched absently at where it had been and then shivered.
Did you see those bug legs on its neck? Ugh! The worst part of it, honestly, but that's not the point. It surprised me at first, but it was just crying and scared. It was like a lost kid.
I've seen plenty of criminals cry and beg when cornered.
Shana, you know that's not...
The dejected tone had Aizawa sighing as he crossed his arms, pointedly not looking at him, and instead at the group that had finally stopped trying to struggle out of their restraints. Look, it could talk, and didn't. We gave it a moment to talk, and all it did was run. I don't care if it healed us, we don't know what the effects of that are, or what it was aiming to do. It was in a fight along with the rest of them, and that means it needed to be brought in for questioning, at the very least. His voice was clipped, and his frustration at the fact that the beast got away seeped into the words as well. Hisashi didn't push the topic any further. They stood quietly for a bit as people left their homes nearby to see what was going on. Aizawa knew some of them had videotaped what happened, so there would likely be videos of whatever the creature was cropping up eventually. The cops arrived shortly after, and the two heroes talked to the officers that were putting the group into holding cars to be taken to the station, giving them their statements and promising to come by and pick up the necessary paperwork later. The patrol cars drove away, and they watched a moment before continuing back on their walk. They had been heading home after eating at a restaurant Hisashi had been begging him to go to all months, and only showed up because they were close enough to hear the fight happening. Aizawa cast one last look at the people on the sidewalks as they talked about and showed off the videos taken on their phones. He would have to find the videos later for more details, but with something that big and that distinct, it couldn't be too hard to find in the future. Izuku was panting heavily as he sat in the alley, human once more, clutching his bag to his chest. He was going to have to wash the blood out of his pants as best as he could, but since they were already black, he probably didn't have to worry too much about any stains. Usually when he spends the early part of the night training, like he would spend the rest of it resting to allow his bigger body to absorb the pain faster. The heroic interruption was unplanned and definitely canceled any plans he had of staying like that. He was stupid. Of course a monster was going to be treated like a monster. What reason would anyone have to believe something so inhuman? Not even the wilder metamorphic quirks looked even remotely close to the slapped-together build he had.
Crap! The videos!
Izuku drug a hand down his tear-streaked face, wincing slightly at the twinge of the pinched nerve. Why did he even try to train like that? It was pointless. He never failed to scare the people who did manage to spot him, and now there was hard video evidence of his existence. Stupid, stupid, stupid! He got reckless, allowed the slight inkling of confidence he had built about getting better control to pull him somewhere he should have never been! He was definitely not going to get any sleep tonight, which meant sleeping any chance he got tomorrow at school. How could he have forgotten what everyone called him? What he called himself? He was Deku. He was a monster. Out of those two things, there was only one he could somewhat control, so he made a decision. He wouldn't try to use his shifting ability ever again unless it was absolutely necessary for his own safety. When things like the fight he got dragged into happened, People intervene. Heroes break it up. Someone helps. Izuku knew that when it came to himself, he was all that he had left.